platforms. So welcome for those of you who've just joined us on either LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram. So we are sort of multicasting here to 5 different streams. Again, through the magic of the great program of Restream, we're able to go live on LinkedIn Live, on Facebook Live, on YouTube, on Instagram, and then we also have our Google Meet over here as well. So thank you for spending some time with us today. Let me share screen with our friends in the uh, on the inside, and let me admit Google side. All right. So admit. We've got more people joining us on the Google. And so hopefully our audience will be growing here shortly on the LinkedIn side. Oh, here we go. Now we are live. Let me just switch views here. And then we're going to get into today's topic. Today's topic is my coworkers are overly vague. Here we go. There we go. Okay. Oh, okay. On the LinkedIn side, now you can see my slideshow better and my face less, which is how it ought to be. So let's get into today's topic. So today's topic is about coworkers being overly vague. Real quick in the chat on the LinkedIn, and again, you can put it over here on the Google side as well, but let me know if you attended either of the first 2 webinars in this series. As a quick review, the first 2 were about extroverts managing introverts, introverts managing extroverts. In both of those, we talked a lot about how preference is sort of the issue of the day, right? That extroversion and introversion are not about skills, they're just about preferences, right? And so real quick, just as a review, if you were in those sessions or even if you weren't, some people mistakenly think that introverts are only capable of certain things, that introverts can't be public speakers, and that's entirely false. Or that extroverts aren't capable of shutting our mouths and listening, and that's entirely false. What extroversion and introversion is about is, do you have a preference when all other things are equal towards recharging internally, introverts, or externally, extroverts? Now, I say the phrase when all other things are equal because the reality is at no point typically are all other things equal. So the Myers-Briggs has 4 different letters, or 4 different sets of letters, 4 different dichotomies is the fancy word. Extrovert and introvert is the first one, but the very next one is sensing and intuition. And it's funny because I think a lot of people, when they think about the Myers-Briggs, they immediately think about extroversion and introversion as the main thing, right? And that's the one that we talk about the most. It's the one that people sort of have an understanding about, although I think the understanding needs to be challenged and updated, because I think it's sort of ascriptive, like ascribing a quality instead of descriptive, which is describing a preference. And so I think that that in general, we don't use the Myers-Briggs very responsibly. But when we do talk about it, we're talking about that first letter, extroversion and introversion. And this second letter, y'all, it is equally or more powerful when it comes to working across difference and leading. So the topic of this webinar is called Leading with Personality. And the reality is that we need to lead across difference. Each of us has a preference for extroversion and introversion. And if you were in the last couple of sessions, I gave tips to introvert leaders who need to manage extroverts, or extrovert leaders who need to manage introverts. And if you want to rewatch those are available on LinkedIn, and they'll be on our website pretty soon as well. But today we're going to get into this second letter of the Myers-Briggs, this second letter. So this is me, my quick bio. I'm not going to go over my bio today, but suffice it to say that I'm an expert in the use of personality type in the office. I'm also certified in the Myers-Briggs. One of my 2 most recent books is Leading with Emotional Intelligence. So I have extensive background in leadership development and the intersection of where leadership development and understanding personality type bumps into each other to help us be more effective leaders. And so this is part of why this webinar came to be. The fun version, these are some fun facts about me. I'll just share that 7 and 2.16 is important because 7 was the amount of years it took me to finish college for my undergraduate degree. That's my undergraduate degree there. And 2.16 was my GPA. And so if the last slide made you think that I have my act together and that I'm a fully formed and actualized human, just know that all of us are imperfect. and that my journey was full of bumps and bruises and twists. And I celebrate those bumps and bruises and twists now because they've made me more empathetic to people navigating the complexity of life. And if you've been in any of my webinars, you know that I do not shy away from talking about race and gender and all the things that make us us. I am a white man who's middle class and college educated. So when I say that sometimes it's hard to navigate life, I also recognize I have a lot of privilege, and that none of those identities I mentioned make my life any harder. So if my life is hard from time to time, I fully am humbled by how much more hard life is for people who don't share all of these identities with me, or some of these identities with me. So I want to acknowledge that. So yeah, I'm also a musician, an improv comedian, and do all kinds of things. And I love visiting Disney World, and I'm going there soon. This speaks to what I was just mentioning. We all have intersecting identities. We cannot have any conversation about personality type, leadership, about communication preferences, about what we're going to talk about today, which is this second letter of the Myers-Briggs and how we perceive the world around us through one of two preferences, according to Jung. We can't have any of those conversations without acknowledging that race and gender and disability and ability status and socioeconomics and all of these things are in the room with us. So my company, Adaptive Challenge Consulting, one of the things we're sort of known for is, so from time to time, we are called on to do sort of classic DEI training, and we love doing that for the right kind of client. But what we're more known for is that when we do leadership training, these concepts show up sometimes because they need to. When we do communications training, these concepts show up. When we do having difficult conversations, when we do harassment training in the workplace, any training we do, we understand that every person in the training has multiple identities, and they don't get to leave any of their identities at home. I never get to leave the house and just leave white at home. Like, white goes with me everywhere I go, right? So all the things that make me me go with me everywhere, and all the things that make you you go with you everywhere. And so they have to be part of our conversation in just very plain conversational ways. One of the things I hope, and if you've been to any of my webinars, or if you've been in any of my, I show this logo here. The negative space between the E and the X in the FedEx logo is an arrow. When I'm addressing large groups of managers, or doing a keynote speech, typically between a fourth and a third of the audience has never seen that arrow before. They have an aha moment. And so if you're in the chat and if today's your first day seeing the arrow, say first time arrow viewer or something like that. Because the reality is that a lot of times there are concepts that have been around us a lot, but until our attention is drawn to them in a new way, we don't have that aha moment. So my hope is that today, in today's workshop, you have some kind of aha moment that you can never un-aha. Because trust me, if today's the first time you've seen the little arrow in between the E and the X, you're never going to unsee it, my friends. Never. A note on the Myers-Briggs, and in the first two webinars, I explained this, but I'll just real quickly, briefly mention it. If you're a true academic, there's a lot of holes that we could poke in Carl Jung's methodology, and we could have that conversation. It's a separate conversation. For his time, he was doing relatively well with research methods, but by modern university standards, the framework that established the Myers-Briggs wouldn't stand up to scrutiny at most major universities now. There are certain ways that in qualitative research he could have phrased it, phenomenological research or cluster sampling. There's some things like that. However, I want to acknowledge that this is not a perfect be-all and end-all framework. It is one framework that I have just found, when used right, is a very, very powerful tool to enhance leadership capacity. Also, Isabella Briggs Myers, I was made aware, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that Isabella Briggs Myers wrote a fiction work that used negative stereotypes about racialized minorities, I think Black people in specific. And so I want to just acknowledge that. It's important to note those things. And then to say that my hope is that through this conversation that we can address personality type and leading with personality through an anti-racism lens and a decolonizing lens. And that's my hope, and that's my intent, and I hope we get there. Do I think that if we keep these contexts in mind, is still a valuable tool? I do, or I wouldn't be doing this webinar. So hang with me. And if you think of creative ways, anybody on the LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube or over on the Google Meet, if you think of creative ways that we can work towards that sort of decolonizing lens and that anti-racist lens towards this work, please share more ideas. So preference, if you've been to any of the other sessions, you understand that preference is not about skill. Preference is just what your default is when all other things are equal. So one example I'll give is that I have a preference for extroversion. I'm an extrovert. I love speaking to people, whether it's strangers in the grocery store, whether it's a keynote speech at a conference, whatever the case is, a workshop. I really, really enjoy and get energy from other folks. There are other times when maybe all other things aren't equal. So, for example, my wife works in the public schools, and her public school teacher friends had a holiday party at my house. And at some point, we have a rec room where everybody was congregating, and my wife, who has an introvert preference, who thinks I can be social anytime, all the time, because from her perspective, I'm social a lot. She said, Go in there and do that thing you do." And I'm like, "What's the thing I do?" She's like, "Go in there and be social. Do the social thing." And when I use the phrase "all of the things being equal," this is part of what I mean, which is, sure, I have an extrovert preference, but my second letter is intuition. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. My third letter is feeling. When you put intuition and feeling into the entity that is Alan and realize those are preferences, suddenly my extroversion isn't just a switch I can turn on at whenever somebody wants. It's tempered by the all other things factors, intuition and feeling in my case, which asks me the questions, hey, if you're going to socialize, are you going to socialize with people who are sort of your people that you have things in common with, people who you can form deep connections with? Intuition is asking me to make deep connections. Feeling is asking me to find my people. And so, again, when we're talking about any one of these four-letter positions in the Myers-Briggs, when we're talking about that, we're just talking about a preference when all of the things are equal. And I acknowledge that in our workplaces, in our home environments, in our family environments, all of the things are not always equal. And so I just want to acknowledge that. But preference is just what you prefer as a default, right? Also note that when we're talking about dichotomies, extrovert versus introvert, intuitive versus sensing, thinking versus feeling, these are each dichotomies, kind of like right-handed and left-handed. I'm right-handed, but I use my left hand all the time. I know, right? Yeah, it's impressive how I can drink coffee with my left hand. The point I'm illustrating is that we're going to talk about sensing and intuition as a preference. I believe that everybody on this call has a preference for either sensing or intuition, and we're going to go through that because this is at the heart of why some people think other people's are vague at work. This is the psychological root of that. But understand that just because you have one preference doesn't mean you're not capable of exhibiting the other kind of behavior. It's just your preference when all of the things are equal. Hope that makes some sense. These are the four dichotomies of the Myers-Briggs. We're pretty familiar with extrovert, introvert. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about intuitive and sensing. In about 2 weeks, we're going to delve a little bit into feeling and thinking. Real quick, though, the break here, that second row, intuitive and sensing, that's how you absorb the world around you. It's psychologically how you absorb the world around you. The third row, feeling and thinking, that's not about how you absorb the world. It's about after you've absorbed the world, how do you make decisions? What's in the lead for you psychologically when you're making decisions? And then eventually we'll get to judging and perceiving as well. So for today, let's talk about how we perceive the world. So I'm going to do this thing that I do live with audiences, and I'm going to give you a second to look at a picture. And then in the chat, I would love you to put what you observed in the picture. So I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to look at this picture and try not to jot anything down while you're looking at the picture, but right after I show you the picture, I'm going to give you 30 more seconds to write down what you saw. So here we go. 30 seconds to look at this picture. So it might be reversed. We're at 17 seconds. All right. Now that you've looked at the picture, grab a scrap piece of paper. Write down what you think you saw. Give you about 30 seconds to do that as well. Down to about 10 seconds. All right. So I don't know how many folks are in each stream, but anybody in the chat, if you want to comment about what you saw in the picture. What's interesting is, and you can comment, but also let me just share this with you kind of in general terms, is that I often ask groups of people to circle on their description, circle how many numbers they wrote down, circle how many colors they wrote down, circle how many position words. So oftentimes, some people, when asked to describe that picture, are going to start with quantifying the pieces of the picture. 3 birds, 3 blackbirds, 1 bluebird, 2 children sitting on top of a rhino wearing a green and blue sweater, etc. Some people have a preference towards describing literally all the pieces and elements on the picture. That's what we call sensing preference. It's a preference for consciously absorbing information around you or the world around you through your direct connection to your senses. Sensing is senses in the simplest term. Some people, when they look at that picture, though, they're not writing down how many birds and how many kids there are. That's not what they're writing down. They're writing down what they think is happening in the picture. And in the chat, if you think you saw a story happening or you think there are emotions being felt by different folks, put that in the chat as well, and I'll see what I see in the chat. But so, oh yeah, that it reminds you of, I have a comment, reminds you of Ireland, right? And so that second way of viewing the picture, where you're not counting the birds or counting the children or describing the colors or positions in the picture, but you're describing what you think is happening in the picture, that's not sensing, that's intuitive. You are literally using intuition to glean a story from a picture, and you're sort of using intuition to make sense of the different elements. For example, I often have people with intuitive preferences tell me that they think the children in that picture are on a journey. Let's go back to that picture. That the young people sitting on the rhino are going on a journey. And the picture doesn't expressly say that, but it does show us symbols that we would associate with a journey. First of all, they're riding on a rhino, so they have a vehicle, they have something to ride on. They're dressed warmly. One of them has a telescope, and one of them has a piece of paper that they're looking at intently. I say a piece of paper, I think it's a map, but the reason I think it's a map is intuition. Literally, all I can tell from looking at the picture is that it's a piece of paper. So understand that Jung and Isabella Myers each think that we break down into one of two preferences on this dichotomy, that we either look at the picture and immediately start counting 3 blackbirds, 1 bluebird, 7 stones with patterns on them, 4 other stones, a tree on the right, a tree on the left, a hut in the background, a woman behind a rock. That's a sensing description. It's a literal description of what's on the picture. Intuition, people with intuitive preferences are telling us what's in the picture. Now, let me just say the phrase again, all other things being equal. When I gave you this prompt, I didn't give you any specificity. And so let me say it this way. I'm intuitive. I have a preference for intuition. If somebody said, Alan, look at this picture and catalog for me how many birds, stones, and children there are, of course I could do that. If the prompt was to count and specify those things, of course I'm capable of doing that. But if the prompt is just tell me what you saw, intuition, that's the all other things being equal. And my intuition is going to be like, I see children on a journey and there's a woman behind a rock, and either she's about to attack them or maybe she's their guardian. I can't quite tell, but I'm going to read into the picture when given an ambiguous prompt. Similarly, people with a sensing preference, people who looked at this picture and immediately started cataloging things, if given the prompt, look at this picture and tell me what you think is happening in the picture. Of course they can do that. People with a sensing preference can, of course, put together different elements and find the theme and the story and the connection of those elements, like people with an intuitive preference do just instinctively. Of course, a sensing person can do that when prompted. The point is, when we're not prompted, we tend to look at pictures or any information either in that granular sensing the elements way or the what I think is happening here way. This is a picture. You might get work emails sometimes. Work emails are read by half of your staff through a sensing lens and half of your staff through an intuitive lens. How can you use that knowledge? So let's keep going. if you were a field commander, I ascribe to Quaker philosophy and theology personally, and Quakers are particularly nonviolent, so committed to nonviolence. And so this metaphor, this analogy for me is a little weird. But what if you were a commander of a battlefield and you had two people on your team, one that you knew had a sensing preference, who could look at that picture of the kids and tell you how many birds there were, how many could count the things really by instinct, and you had one person who had a preference for intuition, the person who's more likely to try to find the patterns, the meaning, what's happening. And say you had two tasks in front of you, and you can share in the chat what you think what you think you might do. You have two tasks. One task is to go scope a battlefield. The other task is to look at like 20 maps of different troop movements to try to find patterns that would predict future behavior. If it's me, I know that my sensing person, when all other things are equal, is going to provide me a very detailed description of all the elements they see. I would probably send my sensing person over to that battlefield to scope out the battlefield because they have a natural preference for that. I would probably send my intuitive person over to the computer or the maps on the wall when it comes time for the need for quick pattern recognition. It's not just about the granular details of each picture. We got 20 pictures. We're trying to find the big theme between and amongst the 20 pictures that's telling us where the troops on the other side are going to move next, right? So I would probably lean into someone who had an intuitive preference. But now keep in mind, and this is one of the things that I hate when managers do, I don't believe for a second that only a sensing person can go do that sensing activity and scope out the battlefield and tell me there's a guard on this tower, a guard on this tower, two tanks, two turret guns, whatever. I don't think that only a sensing person can do that. I think anybody can do that. Someone with an intuitive preference like me, if I was told, go catalog everything you see on the battlefield, of course I can do it. But the person that's got that preference, they've had that preference most of their life. If Jung is correct, and if Isabella Briggs Myers is to be believed, they've had that preference as soon as they were sort of adolescents. And so because of that, they may have built some skill around that. Again, going back to my early slides, skill and preference are different things. But if you have a preference for something, it can lead you to seeking out more experiences, practicing your muscles, and developing some skills from that. So understand that each of us has a preference for how we absorb the world, but then what does this mean practically speaking? So let's talk about this a little bit. Oh, one thing, the bottom bullet point here, practical implication for communicating with others. Half of your audience shares your preference, the other half does not. So I used to speak to a lot of boards, like a board of trustees at a college where I worked. And at that board of trustees meeting, typically when I would present, because I'm intuitive, I'm trying to present sort of big picture conceptual things, but I know that half of my audience is sensing and they want charts and graphs and statistics. So knowing that I was talking to both audiences, I would regularly show a graph or a chart about our college career center's success rate in getting students into their dream graduate school or getting them gainfully employed in a field of their choice. I would share those statistics on a graph, and then I would stop and say, now I want to tell you the story of Amanda. Amanda is a first-generation college student. She decided to major in business. She got an internship with this local business, and now she's got a job. I'm telling those two stories, one with statistics and numbers, one with a person, because I understand half of my audience, the sensing half of my audience, wants those numbers for the information to be meaningful. The other half of my audience, the intuitive audience, wants something that connects to their life, connects to their understanding, connects to what they think the mission of the organization is. And so communicating in both ways is exceptionally valuable when you think about how you are a leader. And again, the topic here is, why are some of my coworkers vague, right? This stereotype comes from overwhelmingly people with a sensing preference listening to folks with intuitive preferences describe things in a way that they feel doesn't have enough detail, in a way that they feel is vague. And really, y'all, this is a personality difference. And I'm going to show you some tips and tricks on how to work across that difference. But understand that oftentimes, if you think your colleagues are vague a lot of the time, odds are pretty good you might have a sensing preference, and odds are pretty good they may have intuitive preferences. Now, again, there's more letters to the Myers-Briggs, the all other things being equal thing. Extroversion, introversion, these things play into it as well. If you have an extrovert who's intuitive, who also has P as their last letter of the Myers-Briggs, which we're going to talk about a few workshops from now, that combination, extrovert, intuitive, P, That combination right there is sort of the combination for distracted by shiny objects, memory of a goldfish, that is one of the more quintessentially vague combinations. Extrovert, intuitive, and then thinking and feeling doesn't play into this as much, but then perceivers. So EN something P types tend to be perceived as some of the most vague people we work with, right? So understand that some of this comes down to personality. So what do we do about it? What do we do? When we're working with coworkers who are vague, understand that you might have a preference for sensing. Your colleagues might have a preference for intuition, and that may be where the frustration is born, right? So here's some tips. If you know that you have more of a sensing preference, that you prefer when you get projects assigned, when you get when there's a task in front of you, you want a standard operating procedure, you want an outline, you want some details about how to proceed. What am I supposed to do next? If you know you're more sensing and you have colleagues or supervisors who are more intuitive and they give you some instruction that seems kind of vague, stop them and say, hey, could you give me like a little outline of the key points? I think I understand you, but could you, an outline, just a real quick outline would be helpful for me. That causes them to slow down and to break down their thoughts into sort of outline format, which could be very helpful in bridging this difference. Another thing, and I do a lot of workshops with teams and organizations about how to do active listening as leaders. And active listening, you need to take time to learn this skill. And extroverts and introverts can both learn these skills. They learn it in a different way because one has a preference for extroversion, one has a preference for introversion, and listening requires a certain kind of mindset that is challenging to navigate. But there are some great ways to do active listening techniques, and one is just what we call a rephrase. Use a rephrase. So if you have a colleague who's being vague, you can do a rephrase. They'll say things like, make sure that you have columns X, Y, Z, double A, and double B finished by close of business Monday. And you could then ask a rephrasing question. Hey, I think you're saying that by this coming Monday, I need to have all the data entered in the columns between X and double B. Is that what you're saying? That rephrasing, you're putting a little more information in there. You're saying, because they said Monday, they didn't say which Monday. So you're saying this coming Monday, you're adding some specificity in your rephrasing and then saying, does that sound right? Did I get what you're saying? Did I catch it right? This is going to feel weird when you first start doing it. It just is. It is. Counselors and therapists do this all the time. It's a regular part of their practice. But leaders can and should be doing rephrasing to slow us down and make sure that we're listening to each other more closely. So if you're working with someone who's prone to saying things in more vague, abstract ways, and you want more concrete, you want a more concretized, concrete way of understanding this, use that rephrase. If you have any comments in the chat and want to share anything, let me know. But otherwise, we are going to keep on moving. All right. The next set of tips is when giving tasks. Say that you have a sensing preference and that you tend to give outlines and instructions, but maybe you're supervising some of these folks that you think are more vague, and some of these folks who may have an intuitive preference in the Myers-Briggs. And again, I'm not saying all people with intuitive preferences are vague. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, after working as a leadership development trainer for 30 years, when I hear the common complaint about someone being vague, it often, I'd say 80% plus of the time, can be traced back to the personality type preferences of each of the individuals, and specifically this sensing and intuition letter. This is one of the main catalysts for where we get this stereotype about being vague. Yes. And Angela, to your point, if you have an S preference, you're probably giving a lot of detail. But if you're talking to someone who's an intuitive, they want after the detail, before the detail, in the middle of the detail, they want context. Not just we need to do this, but they want to know, why do we need to do it that way? Why do we need to do it in that order? Why is it this project is important for our goals as a company or an organization? Why is it that this path forward is important to our mission? So understand, Angela, great question there. Yes, so if you have a sensing preference, you can choose to meet intuitive folks more where they are. And so if you're going to give them a robust outline of this is what you need to do to get this project done, Uh, yes, more details equals clearer communication. It's not always the outcome. Some people in some situations, correct, Angela. And so again, still be who you are. Still, if you know you have a sensing preference, and if you know you are prone to giving detail, still do that. Don't betray who you are, but meet your intuitive colleagues halfway and say, okay, so we need to do, part one, two, three, 3A, 3B, and then we can finally get to part four of this project. And then you can say, and just to give a little context, part of why we do 3A and B before we do four is because this is important. Or part of why we did two this way this year, and we did two a different way last year, is because this thing changed with the policy of the R&D department, or the HR department changed the policy, and we have to do it a little bit differently. Stopping to give a little bit more context about why these things are happening, right? It's funny because some of you are familiar with the concept of mansplaining, whitesplaining, these kinds of concepts. That concept I trace most directly to people with an extrovert, intuitive, thinking, judging preference. Extrovert, intuitive, thinking, judging, ENTJ. The ENTJs are some of the most quintessential mansplainers, whitesplainers, over explainers of context. Because, like I'm saying, hey, if you're a sensing person, give a little more context. An extrovert, intuitive might be giving people so much context that it's driving them nuts, right? And there's too much context and too little detail sometimes, right? So understand that a lot of this is traced down to type. You can check in with the second bullet point here. You can check in with coworkers that you think are vague. You can say something like, I'm not sure I explained the project as well as I could have. Could you give me a quick overview of what you think the components are, just for my peace of mind? In other words, you're asking them to rephrase you a little bit. So the rephrasing is a tool you can use at any time, but you can also ask a colleague, hey, I know I just described it to you. I don't know if I got it across well. What did you hear are the key components? That way you're sort of putting it in the terms of, I'm trying to get better as a supervisor. I'm checking in on whether I'm communicating well enough. Can you give me a quick blow by blow of what you think the key components are? That's one way to do that and bridge that gap. Now, notice in parentheses, I put, this works best when you've done shared expectations work in your office. Shared expectations is something that some of your teams have done. You might call it a social contract, a set of office commitments. There's a lot of different ways we talk about this. This isn't just an office value sort or an office value statement. This is more of a commitment to how we treat each other kind of statement. I call it shared expectations. If your office has gone about this business, these kinds of conversations go a lot more smoothly. And I'll tell you that that my team and I, Adaptive Challenge Consulting, we help teams learn how to create shared expectations, and not just create them, but keep them alive, keep them active, and keep them as a meaningful leadership and management tool. When you do create shared expectations on work teams, it makes difficult conversations so much less difficult. So notice that this second bullet point here is you really doing a check-in. You might be someone with a sensing preference. You might be assigning a task to someone with an intuitive preference. You're wanting them to rephrase. You're like, I'm not sure I explained this project as well as I could have. Can you give me a quick explanation of what you think the key components are? You're asking them to check in. Doing that artificially without having created shared expectations about how we treat each other at work might be a little clunky. So if you're curious about shared expectations, send me an email, info@adaptivechallengeconsulting.com. I do have a guide that I give out to folks if you're curious about that. But it's a powerful, powerful tool. When thinking about how other forms of communication, people with intuitive preferences seem vague, but the flip side is often those people are pretty good at imagination, figuring out connections, at storytelling. They usually have a preference towards storytelling and a preference towards integrating of ideas because it's just what they sort of the preference they have as intuitives. So if you're leading and managing folks who are vague, you may notice that because of this preference, they may have just a natural knack for connecting different ideas that aren't typically connected, where you have a CRM system and Google Suite and trying to connect these two systems and it doesn't seem to quite work. You're calling your vendor, can you put in a patch for this? And meanwhile, the intuitive person will say, well, you know that you can, on our vendor thing, on our CRM, you can download a CSV file and just dump it into Google Sheets, and it just works like that. And they might be able to sort of map different systems that aren't normally connected and go, here's how they could connect. So understand that on the flip side of being vague, is probably a preference for that has led to an aptitude for connection, storytelling, and integrating of different ideas. Um, when you have data that you need to present, if you're ever in a position where you need to present to a group to persuade. So if you know, I don't know if anybody here is a lawyer, if you ever are jury facing and having to persuade a group, if you're ever doing a sales pitch, you're trying to convince someone to do commerce with you, trying to trying to reach them on a personal level, a sales pitch, whether it's financial sales, whether it's recruitment at a college or university, whether it's trying to sell them an idea, people with those intuitive preferences who seem vague can often be that person at the end of a sales pitch, the end of a persuasive pitch, to help really, really connect things. In other words, if the people with sensing preferences are prone to explain a sales proposition as, you know, if you do business with us, you'll get X, Y, and Z, and you spell out X and you spell out Y and you spell out Z in full detail, and then you've got a colleague who's probably one of your more vague colleagues, maybe has that intuitive preference, and they're picking up on the body language every time you say that by Z, and I don't know what these would be, but every time you get to Z, that person, because of how intuitives prefer to take in the world, that intuitive person might be picking up on subtle shifts in body language among several people you're presenting to every time you talk about that middle component. And that those subtle shifts in body language might prompt that person to go, huh, how can I make sure that because it seems like X is fine, it seems like Z is fine, but the middle one, Y, how can I get Y to connect more deeply to this audience? This is where intuition comes in, right? So understand, when closing a persuasive argument, a sales pitch, etc., that intuition, the people with that intuitive preference, that can be their time to shine. In other words, people with a sensing preference are probably really, really good preference-wise at leading into the stats and the rationale. But when it comes to reconnecting it with the person you're trying to persuade, that intuitive can really help. Finally, and I think this is the last tip, I might have one more slide, but when thinking about emails, here's the thing, and this is going to seem counterintuitive, pun fully intended. I can go ahead and tell you that there's something in the Myers-Briggs called the Keirsey temperaments, and the Keirsey temperaments takes the 16 different letter combinations and puts them in 4 large clusters. If you want to know about the Keirsey temperaments, email me. I've got information I can send you about that. But the Keirsey temperaments, people who share sensing, S, like we're talking about, that tend to have a preference for absorbing facts, and judging for their last letter, which for the short term for today, I'll just say judging is a preference toward closure, a preference towards completion. People who share that S and that J together, I can count on those coworkers of yours to read their emails. Because of their preferences, because they have a preference towards collecting information in a granular, piece at a time way, and because they have a preference towards closure through judging, that 4th letter, because of that, they are most likely to read your emails completely. Meanwhile, many of your intuitive colleagues, particularly if they have NF and NFP in their personality makeup, are less likely to read your emails as thoroughly as you would like. So what do you do? What do? Do you just go to them and yell, read your emails? Do you just shame them when they missed it? Say, I sent this in an email last week. Why didn't you catch it? What do you do? If you really want to be the best leader possible, if you really, really want to communicate the most effective way possible, in your emails, you're going to write to both crowds. As a matter of fact, in your emails, you're going to write a little more to the intuitive crowd. The sensing crowd mostly is you can count on them to read your emails. And this is going to seem, again, counterintuitive, but for intuitive folks, the more you can make bullet points, the better. Because think about it this way, the sensing folks, when looking at that picture that I showed with the birds and the children, the sensing folks have a preference towards cataloging the pieces, finding the pieces, the proverbial bullet points, if you will. Intuitive folks, it's helpful if the bullet points are extra bullet pointy. In other words, the bullet points would be the equivalent of, on that picture, having a little legend on the side that says, birds, how many, question mark, stones with patterns, how many, question mark, stones without pattern, how many, question mark, children, how many, question mark. It draws their attention to key details, which is important because most people with an intuitive preference, if they look at that picture, they're not looking for key details. They're not seeking out their subconscious is seeking the connection of all the details, but they're not honing in on any one of the details. So what do? If you want to reach them more effectively, you spoon feed a little bit. you spoon feed a little bit. Now, if your organization is doing work with the Myers-Briggs, if you bring in somebody like my company or another group to do work where you're actually talking type, you can say, this is a two-way street. I'm going to spoon feed you a little bit to reach you where you are. And because we've had this workshop and you know you're intuitive and you know that your preference isn't to read the details, I want you to increase your skill on reading details. And I'm going to do my part as your leader by sending you more bullet points. I hope that makes some sense. This is all about bridging the gap across these differences. Real quick, coming up next week, and next week will not be on Thursday. Next week's will be on Friday, March 20th. We're going to go to the other side of this coin. Today was about coworkers being vague. That's a criticism I often hear from people with a strong sensing preference about their intuitive colleagues. Next week on Friday the 20th, we're going to flip the script. What is it intuitive colleagues think about their sensing supervisors, their sensing colleagues? What is it they think? I'll give you a hint. It's not being vague. Oftentimes they feel micromanaged. Intuitive folks, when given too much detail, will think, well, they're giving me all this detail because they don't trust me. That's something that intuitive, particularly intuitive feelers, NFs, we call it the Kiersey temperaments, we call this the idealists, but intuitive feelers will often make that mistake. And we're going to talk about how to address that and how to work through that. Also, there's more up. We're also going to get into thinking and feeling in coming up weeks. The themes there on management doesn't care enough, and that's on March 24th. And then my supervisor is not very logical. That's on April 9th. So RSVP for all those. Go over to adaptivechallenge.com, go to the free resources, and you can register for the entire series. Also, if you missed Extroverts Leading Introverts and Introverts Leading Extroverts, they are on LinkedIn at Adaptive Challenge Consulting. You can go watch the replay and catch up on those. Really, I think some really good tips, especially the Introverts Leading Extroverts one. I think there's some fantastic tips in there. If you want to buy my books, here's some books. The two on the left are by me, Improv Comedy, The Art of Leadership, and Leading with Emotional Intelligence. On the right are by my friends and colleagues, Dr. Danielle Green and Dr. Kelly Dixon, aka Dr. K. Thank you, George. Thanks. So check out those books. And again, if you and your team are interested in working with us, this is the Adaptive Challenge Consulting. These are the affiliates. Connect with us. Here's a QR code. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. What if S's feel micromanaged as well? Angela, great question. Of course, you can still feel micromanaged. Of course. And so micromanaging comes from a variety of things, right? It comes from trust. It comes from whether or not your office and your space has shared expectations and has gone through that exercise. And Angela, we could talk sometime about how to facilitate that, how to make that part of your culture. So there are a lot of things that lead to micromanaging, a lot of things. And one of the most typical things has its roots in this personality difference. Now, but there are other things too, because I always say all other things being equal, because you know what, Angela? Gender's in the room, my friend. Race is in the room, my friend. And I don't know, in my experience, I'm going to stick to my experience. In my experience, stereotypes that people on the privileged end of different identity spectra, stereotypes that they hold consciously and subconsciously about minoritized groups, whether it's women, whether it's Black people, whether it's Latina people, whether it's other people of color, whether it's disabled people, anybody who's on the less privileged end of any spectrum will sometimes get that dose of micromanaging as well, having nothing to do with sensing and intuition. Now, sensing and intuition will add fuel to the fire, right? In other words, if there are bad assumptions about the competence of Black people, the competence of women by white men or by any men or any white people, in those contexts, there could be those other intervening factors that lead people to micromanage. That's a thing. And this sensing and intuitive thing is also a thing. Extra bullet pointy, please, with color coding. I read those first. If nothing else stands out, I close the email and come back later. Yes, I can't see the name on that comment, but yes, that's me. I'm an ENFP, intuitive. I want the bullet points. I want color coded because it draws my attention to things. And sometimes if the email is too long, I'll gloss over it and tell myself I'm going to come back to it later. And then sometimes I don't come back to it later, and I probably should have, right? And so the more that we can communicate what the key points of an email are, and then even use those points to reference, so sometimes I'll send somebody 3 bullet points, and in the 3rd bullet point, I'll say, and if you read nothing else in this email, please read the last paragraph, where I'm getting a 4th bullet point in there sort of by conveying that. But yeah, but Angela, back to that about people with a sensing preference feeling micromanaged. Again, none of this is in a vacuum. Every person with a sensing preference has a gender, has a race, has a disability or ability status, has all these other things that make them them. There's supervisors who may or may not be micromanaging them, or are micromanaging them, or seem to be micromanaging them, or wherever it is. It could have to do with other things that make us us, and it could have to do with the sensing and intuition dichotomy. I think that these things, in my experience, these things often sort of double up on each other. In other words, someone with a intuitive preference, or someone with a sensing preference with a lot of intuitive supervisees, might automatically sort of come across as micromanaging. And if that supervisor happens to be a white dude, and if most of the people they supervise are white women, black women, Latino women, it's fuel on the fire, Angela. It's taking something that's in part grounded in our personality, and it's adding in layers of bias. Yeah, Angela, in my experience, I found that leaders with anxiety, but yes. So that anxiety is a whole nother conversation. Exactly. And I'm not a mental health professional, and I am not at all really qualified to speak about how an anxiety disorder may play into this. But I can tell you that managers who are anxious, just the emotion of being anxious, which is different from a diagnosed anxiety disorder, but people who are anxious, a lot of times there are certain Myers-Briggs types that I find are more anxious than others. And I can tell you that often the ISTJs, the ESTJs, even if they are not anxious, they will sometimes come across as anxious. And there's a whole reason for that. And if your organization wants me to come in and do some workshops, I can get into sort of the finer points of that. But there are reasons for this as well. But anyway, thank you all for your time and attention and thoughtful conversation today. And again, next week, instead of Thursday, we're going to be on Friday, March 20th. And join me for the flip side of this conversation. You can RSVP over at Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn. But thank you all, and I hope you have an amazing Thursday. Take care.